Have you ever wondered what truth might still be sleeping beneath the mountains we pass every day? What if a single sound under the earth could uncover a secret buried for 70 years? This is the story of Jake Miller, a working-class veteran, and his loyal dog Max, who followed the echoes of a forgotten train and found the proof that cleared an innocent man and changed an entire community. As you listen, may this journey remind you that courage still matters and that light always rises from darkness. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The evening air over the mountain road was cool and still. A soft mist clung to the tips of the pines, and the fading light cast long shadows across the abandoned rail line beside the dirt path. The sky carried the last strokes of pale gold behind the ridge as the wind settled into a quiet breath. Jake Miller walked slowly along the uneven ground with a tired posture that belonged to a man who had lived several lives inside one body. He was 40 years old, with a solid frame shaped by military service and years of physical labor. His hair was a muted brown, cut short for convenience, and streaked lightly by early gray. His beard was trimmed, but rough, and showed the kind of neglect that came from long days of work and long nights wrestling with memories he wished he could set aside. His face was strong with sharp angles around the jaw, but the most striking thing about him was the quiet in his eyes. It was a quiet forged in the desert during the Iraq deployment, where he had learned to hold fear and duty in the same breath. Even now, that quiet shaped the way he moved, as if always prepared to react, but never eager to speak before he needed to. Jake worked as a mountain road repairman in a small rural region, where every season carried its own struggle. The job was honest and demanded strength more than words. He patched rock slides, cleared fallen branches, and repaired old metalwork near the rail corridor that wrapped around the ridge. The pay was modest and the days were long, but he carried out each task without complaint, because routine steadied the noise inside him. Back home, Jake lived in a small wooden cabin at the edge of the tree line. The structure was old, with weathered boards and a metal roof that clicked when the temperature fell. Inside, everything was simple and worn. A small table, a narrow bed, and a cast-iron stove that breathed warmth into the chilled nights. The cabin was not much, but it was shelter, and it was quiet, and Jake valued quiet more than anything. His only companion was Max, the German shepherd, who trotted at his side now, with alert ears and a sweeping tail. Max was 3 years old, with a powerful build and a coat that mixed black and tan into a pattern as sharp as his senses. He had been rescued from a crowded shelter 2 years earlier. The staff had described him as intelligent and hyper-aware, and possibly too intense for casual pet owners. Jake had understood that kind of intensity. When he saw the dog, he felt a connection that asked for no explanation. Max had become his shadow ever since. Max knew when Jake woke from nightmares. Max knew when the silence turned heavy in the cabin. Max knew when Jake tried to hide the tremor in his hands before a memory could settle. To Jake, the dog was a grounding force, something alive and loyal and unbroken. On this evening, the path beneath them crunched softly with dirt and scattered gravel. Jake walked with slow, heavy steps, savoring the calm that came after a workday spent hauling beams and reshaping washed-out ground near the ridge. The fading sun curled behind the mountains, leaving a blue-gray cast that wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. Max moved ahead of him, sniffing the ground with growing intensity. Jake noticed the shift, but he did not speak. He trusted the dog more than he trusted most people in this town. The abandoned rail line ran parallel to the path. Rust clung to the rails, and the wooden ties had begun to splinter from years of cold mountain winters. The rails curved toward a stony rise and disappeared into a thicket of brush. Jake passed this place often on his evening walks. Something about the quietness of it made him feel anchored. Tonight, however, something felt different. Max came to a full stop. His posture grew rigid, and his ears pricked forward with sudden focus. His chest expanded slightly as he drew in the air. Jake slowed. He had seen this stance before, during lightning storms, and once when a strange truck lingered too long near the cabin. It was the stance of warning. Max stepped toward a patch of ground near the rail bed. Then the dog barked once, a deep, powerful sound that echoed off the ridge. Jake felt the vibration in his chest. Max began scraping at the dirt with determined strokes of his paws. Jake approached with cautious curiosity. The soil under Max shifted, and small stones bounced aside as the dog dug faster and more urgently. Jake knelt and placed one hand on the ground to steady himself. His fingers brushed against an area where the soil felt thinner, almost hollow. He leaned closer, pressing his ear toward the earth. At first he heard nothing, but then a strange sound resonated through the ground. It was a deep, empty echo like striking metal, hidden beneath layers of dirt. The sensation rippled up his arm, sending a cold pulse into his spine. The sound was not natural. It was not rock. It was something made by hands and machines and time. He tapped the ground lightly with his knuckles. The echo answered again, low and hollow, and impossibly large. A sudden wave of memory surged inside him. It reminded him of the cavernous metal storage units in Iraq, where abandoned equipment hummed with heat. It reminded him of the moments before an explosion, when silence tightened the air. Jake drew a long breath as the mountain breeze brushed across his face. He felt the ground beneath him as more than soil. It felt like a secret waiting to break through. Max gave a soft whine and nudged Jake with his nose, urging him to understand that this was not ordinary earth. Jake steadied his breath. His thoughts folded inward as if a door in his mind creaked open. Why would the ground carry a metallic echo beneath an abandoned track in a small mountain town? Why here? Why beneath an old rail line no one had touched in decades? The questions pressed into him even without punctuation. He placed his palm flat on the dirt, feeling the cold firmness beneath the thin layer of loose soil. A heaviness settled in his chest, not fear, exactly, but anticipation. He understood instinctively that whatever rested under this ground had waited a long time to be heard again. Max stared at him, eyes bright and unwavering. The dog huffed once, as if urging him to acknowledge that this moment mattered. Jake rose, slowly brushing dirt from his knees, but his gaze stayed fixed on the disturbed patch of earth. He felt the weight of something unknown pressing against his thoughts. For the first time in a long while, the quiet around him did not bring comfort. It brought questions. And in the hollow echo beneath the soil, he sensed the beginning of something much larger than himself. The morning settled over the small mountain town with a pale gray sky and a thin layer of fog drifting above the rooftops. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of wet pine and distant wood smoke. Jake Miller walked slowly toward the gas station near the town crossroads, with Max trotting beside him. Jake had slept poorly again. The echo from the ground the night before kept returning to him in restless waves. He had lain awake inside the wooden cabin, listening to Max shift on the floor, and feeling the strange mix of curiosity and unease that had stirred inside him. His thoughts churned with the same silent rhythm that had haunted him since he came home from war. He hoped a walk into town would steady his mind. The gas station sat on a patch of cracked pavement next to a gravel lot. The small building was faded with peeling paint and an old sign that buzzed faintly from its flickering lights. Sitting on a metal chair outside the entrance was Tom Harrington, known simply as Tom to most of the residents. Tom was in his late 70s, with a lean frame that looked as if it had been shaped by years of farm work and mountain winters. He had a narrow face lined deeply at the cheeks and forehead, giving the impression of a man who had spent much of his life squinting into sunlight and wind. His beard was a thin white layer that covered his jaw, but did not hide the sharpness of his chin. Tom had pale blue eyes that observed everything with the slow, careful patience of someone who had seen more than he cared to discuss. His voice usually carried the weight of old stories and memories that had settled into his bones. Tom raised his head as Jake approached and nodded in a greeting that was simple but sincere. Jake had known Tom in the way most locals did, not as a close friend, but as a steady presence in the background of town life. Tom rarely smiled, yet he was known for being fair and straightforward. People respected him even if he rarely spoke at length. Jake appreciated that kind of man, someone who did not waste words. Jake stopped a few steps from him. Max sat down obediently, but remained alert with ears slightly lifted. Jake noticed that Tom studied the dog for a moment with quiet admiration. Tom began speaking before Jake could say anything. His voice was low and dry, like old wood. "You look troubled this morning, Jake." Jake hesitated. He was not used to sharing his thoughts easily, but something in Tom created a sense of safety. Or perhaps it was simply the need to understand what he had heard last night. "The ground near the old rail line felt strange," Jake said slowly. "Hollow in a way that does not make sense." Tom leaned back in his chair and exhaled as if he had been waiting for someone else to notice. "That rail line holds many stories, Jake. More than people here like to admit." Jake listened closely. Tom rarely spoke like this unless he had a reason. What kind of stories, Jake asked, even though he already sensed the direction. The old man looked toward the mountains, his eyes clouded with memory. In 1950, there was a relief train meant to bring supplies into this region after a hard winter. Food medicine blankets. Everyone waited for it, but it never arrived. Jake felt his pulse slow. There was no warning. Tom continued. The train went into the mountain tunnel and was never seen again. No wreckage, no crew, no nothing. It just disappeared. Jake frowned gently. He tried to picture it. A train full of hope swallowed by the mountain without explanation. Tom picked at a loose thread on his jacket sleeve, as if the act helped him hold the heavy story. People wanted answers. Weeks passed with no sign of the train. The company running the line pointed to one man, the engineer in charge, said he made a mistake, said he ignored warnings, blamed him for everything. Jake waited, but Tom did not continue right away. When the silence stretched, Jake felt a faint hollow inside his chest, as if something unseen pressed against him. "Who was the engineer?" Jake asked finally. Tom looked at him with a slow, measured gaze. The kind of gaze a man gives when he knows his words will cut deeper than he intends. His name was Miller. Jake froze. The world seemed to narrow into a single point. The fog, the cold, the faint hum of the sign above them all faded into the background. Tom continued speaking, unaware of how sharply the name struck. He was called a traitor by some, said he abandoned his duty, left people to die. The rumor grew until it became the story people chose to remember. Jake swallowed against the dryness in his throat. Miller. The name echoed in his mind like a blow. For a moment he could not breathe. His thoughts tangled in confusion and disbelief. He had never heard of any relative involved in a train accident. His family had never spoken about anything like this. His father had been a distant, stern man who rarely discussed the past. Jake remembered how the man avoided questions and changed the subject whenever the family history drifted too close. Jake had assumed it was personal pain or old grudges. Now he wondered whether shame had shaped that silence. Tom noticed the change in Jake, and his expression shifted into a quiet regret. "I should not have said it so bluntly," he murmured. "But people should know. It was not fair then. It is not fair now." Jake forced himself to breathe steadily, but the inside of his chest felt tight, like something fragile had cracked. The idea that someone in his family might have been blamed for a tragedy felt like a heavy hand closing around his heart. He did not know the man, did not know the truth, but he understood what it meant to be misjudged by those who did not understand the pain behind decisions. He had lived through war. He had faced accusations from those who never stepped onto the desert sands. Now he wondered whether the same cruel misunderstanding had followed a man who shared his last name. Jake felt the old, familiar weight of responsibility settle again on his shoulders. A weight he thought he had shed after leaving the army. But it returned now, like an echo from a part of himself he had tried to bury. Max pressed gently against Jake's leg, sensing the shift in his mood. Jake lowered a hand and touched the dog's head, feeling the steady warmth that grounded him. Tom spoke again in a softer voice. "You are not to blame for what happened then, Jake. But the town remembers names. And sometimes a name carries more than it should." Jake nodded slowly, but the words did little to ease the tightening in his chest. He felt the weight of the name Miller with new intensity. He wondered how many people in this town whispered the story behind his back. He wondered how many looked at him, and wondered whether disgrace ran in his blood. The thought stung deeper than he expected. Jake managed to thank Tom for speaking honestly. Then he turned to walk home, the gravel crunching under his boots. Max stayed close with every step. The mountain wind brushed across Jake's face, but it did not clear his thoughts. Instead, it seemed to carry the echo of the name Miller, like a lingering question. As he walked, the memory of the hollow sound beneath the earth returned, again and again. The ground had spoken to him in a way he could not understand. Now the past had spoken too, and together they formed a weight that settled deep in his chest. By the time Jake reached the cabin, his jaw was clenched and his hands were tight fists at his sides. A heaviness had seeped into him. Not fear, but sorrow. Sorrow that someone before him had been abandoned by the truth. And sorrow that he now carried part of that burden without knowing whether he had the strength to uncover what lay beneath it. He looked toward the ridge where the old rail line curved into the shadows. The mountain was quiet again, but Jake sensed a stirring beneath its silence. A question waiting for him. A truth waiting for a voice. Jake stepped inside the cabin with Max following behind him. The door closed softly, but the weight inside his chest remained. Whatever had happened in 1950 was not finished. And tonight, Jake felt the first pull of a story that had waited half a century for someone to listen. The afternoon sky was a flat sheet of pale blue above the ridge. The air was cool and dry, and the light slid gently across the tops of the pines. A faint breeze stirred the branches and carried with it the smell of earth and old leaves around the abandoned rail line. Jake Miller walked slowly along the same stretch of track where he had heard the hollow sound days before. His steps were quiet, but his mind was loud. Since the talk with old Tom, his thoughts had kept circling back to the lost train, the vanished crew, and the name Miller whispered as if it were a stain. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw a train disappearing into dark rock and felt the weight of blame fall onto a man he had never known yet shared blood with. The notion that his own family line might be tied to disgrace made his chest feel tight and heavy. Max trotted a few paces ahead of him, nose low to the ground and ears alert. The German shepherd seemed even more focused than usual. His coat of black and tan rippled with each movement, and the strong muscles beneath his fur worked with smooth confidence. Max was a dog who had learned to read the world through scent and vibration. To him, the ground was not just earth, but a map of stories. Jake watched the dog with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. Max had been restless all morning, pacing near the cabin door and nudging Jake until he agreed to walk back to the tracks. Part of Jake wanted to avoid this place and the echo he had heard beneath it, but another part knew that turning away would only let the questions grow darker inside his mind. He could not stand that thought. As they neared the bend, where the rail curved toward the rocky rise, Max slowed. His head lifted and his ears pricked forward. Jake felt his own body respond to the change. His shoulders tightened and his steps grew careful. Max moved directly to the patch of ground near the old wooden ties where the soil had seemed thinner before. Without hesitation, the dog began to dig. His paws cut into the dirt with determined strokes, sending clumps of earth and small stones flying aside. Jake knelt beside him and placed one hand on the disturbed ground. Beneath the loose surface, he felt the same strange hollowness as if something solid lay just under the skin of the earth. Max let out a short bark, filled with urgency, then went back to digging even harder. After a few minutes, the tips of his claws scraped against something that did not give way. The sound was sharp and metallic. Jake brushed Max gently aside and cleared the remaining soil with his hands. His fingers met cold, rough metal. A narrow shape slowly emerged from the dirt. It was a box made of steel, the size of a large book, perhaps a bit thicker. Its surface was scarred and darkened by rust, but the edges still held a suggestion of once clean lines. Jake studied it in silence for a moment. The box looked as if it had been buried for decades. His heart began to beat faster. He could feel Max standing close against his shoulder, the dog's breath, steady and warm in the cool air. With careful effort, Jake lifted the box out of the hole. It was heavier than it looked, and the weight suggested that something important had been sealed inside. There was no lock, left intact, just a warped seam along the edge where time and pressure had done their work. Jake held the box for a long breath. A deep unease moved through him, but so did a stubborn determination. He had spent years letting the past remain a blur. Now it stood in his hands in the shape of old steel. He carried the box back to the cabin with Max padding beside him. Inside the cabin, the air felt close and still. The low afternoon light slipped through the small window and fell across the worn wooden table. Jake set the box down and fetched a flat-headed tool from his small collection of repair gear. His hands were steady, but his chest felt tight as he wedged the metal into the seam of the lid and pried. The rusty edge resisted, then gave with a rough scrape. A faint smell of stale paper and oil rose from inside. He set the lid aside. Within the box lay a bundle of papers, wrapped in cloth, that had once been white, but now had turned yellow and brown with age. Jake lifted the bundle gently. The fabric crumbled in places and exposed the edges of a worn notebook and several folded letters. The handwriting on them was faded and slanted the style of another generation. He opened the notebook first. The pages were stiff but still readable. They held dated entries written in careful script. The first lines described routine work on the rail line, the condition of the engine, the schedule of deliveries. As Jake read further, the tone shifted. The writer spoke of strange cargo-heavy sealed crates, loaded under the watch of men in dark coats who avoided questions. The train had been called a relief train, carrying supplies for towns after a harsh winter, but the engineer did not believe that story. He described a sharp chemical odor that seeped even through the crates. He noted the warnings from a few workers who whispered that the cargo was not food or medicine, but experimental chemicals meant for testing a new weapon. Jake felt the muscles in his jaw clench as he read. The engineer wrote that he wanted to stop the train before the mountain tunnel, that something in his gut screamed that to go through would be a mistake that could not be undone. But higher authorities overruled him. Orders came down with cold clarity. The train would proceed on schedule. Any refusal would be treated as desertion and treason. The last pages of the notebook were shorter, more urgent, as if written in stolen moments. Jake turned them carefully and found the words grow more strained. The engineer wrote about the weight of the decision bearing down on him, about the faces of the crew who trusted him, about the fear that the cargo could poison not just a hillside, but an entire valley if an accident occurred. Jake realized he was holding his breath. He forced himself to inhale and exhale slowly. The ink on the final entry had bled slightly, as if the writer had pressed hard, or the page had been damp when the words were laid down. The entry ended abruptly with a simple statement that the train would enter the tunnel that night, and that if the notebook was ever found, whoever read it should understand that he tried to prevent disaster, but was compelled to obey. Beneath the notebook lay the folded letters. Jake opened one. The paper crackled in his hands. The letter was addressed to no official authority, but seemed written to anyone in the future who might uncover it. The engineer confessed that the train was not a relief train at all, but a hidden transport of dangerous experimental chemicals. He explained that he had tried to report his concerns and had been threatened that his name would be ruined if he refused to drive the train into the mountain. He wrote that if there was any way to stop the cargo from being used, he would take it, even if it cost his life and his reputation. Another letter contained a rough sketch. Jake spread it out on the table. Lines drawn in dark pencil showed a mountain ridge, a rail line, and a tunnel. Beside the main opening, a second passage was marked, and there were notes about a plan to seal part of the tunnel in case of catastrophe. The drawing suggested a hidden section of tunnel blocked off from view. Jake traced the lines with his fingertip. The shape of the ridge looked familiar, similar to the curve of the hills above the old rail where Max had dug. As understanding settled in his stomach, he felt both dread and clarity. The ground had sounded hollow because there was something beneath it. A tunnel, perhaps sealed long ago. Maybe the very place this engineer had tried to mark for whoever might come after. Jake leaned back in his chair and stared at the papers. His thoughts moved slowly but deeply. The engineer, whose words he held in his hands, had been caught between obedience and conscience, between orders and the weight of potential disaster. Jake understood that conflict too well. War had forced him to make choices that still followed him through quiet nights. The idea that this man had been branded a coward or a traitor for questioning lethal cargo felt like a familiar injustice. Jake felt a new kind of anger rise inside him. Not the wild, uncontrolled anger that burned short and hot, but the steady anger that sharpened into resolve. He knew he could not read these pages and pretend he had never seen them. Yet he also knew he was one man with limited power. He needed someone who understood the law and the way the world worked beyond the mountain road. He thought of the small law office near the town center. He had seen the sign for Emma Clark, attorney at law, more than once. He had heard from other veterans that she handled claims and appeals for men who had come back from war with scars others could not see. Emma Clark was in her early 30s, with a firm reputation in a town that did not always welcome change. She was of medium height, with dark hair, usually tied back to keep it clear of her face while she worked. Her features were clean and precise, a straight nose, a determined jaw, and eyes of deep brown that carried both softness and sharp attention. People said she listened more than she spoke. They also said she had driven herself through law school after watching her own father struggle for years to secure basic support as an injured factory worker. That history had carved a sense of justice into her character and made her relentless when she believed someone was being wronged. Jake gathered the notebook, the letters, and the metal box and placed them carefully into a worn canvas bag. His hands moved with deliberate care, as if the past might crumble if he treated it roughly. Max watched every motion from his place near the door, his head tilted slightly. When Jake closed the bag, Max rose, as if he already understood they were heading out. The walk into town felt different this time. The road dipped and rose, and the air seemed to hum with the weight of secrets resting just below the surface. Jake kept one hand on the strap of the bag and the other loose by his side. Each step carried the awareness that he was not simply a road repairman at this moment, but the carrier of a story that had waited many years to be heard. When he reached the small building that housed Emma Clark's office, he paused. The front was simple, with a glass door and a modest sign. Soft light glowed from inside. He opened the door and stepped in. The interior smelled faintly of paper, ink, and coffee. Emma sat behind a wooden desk, piled with folders. She looked up as he entered, her expression shifting from focused concentration to steady curiosity. There was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, shoulders straight, eyes attentive. Jake felt a strange mixture of nervousness and relief. He crossed the room and placed the canvas bag gently on her desk. Inside, he said in a calm, low voice, are the words of a man who drove a train that never came home, and proof that the story this town believed about him may be terribly wrong. Emma regarded the bag, then looked back at Jake. In her gaze, he sensed that she understood the weight of what he was bringing before she even touched it. For the first time since he had heard the echo beneath the mountain, Jake felt that he might not have to carry this burden alone. The evening settled over the town with a dim silver light as thin clouds drifted across the sky, and a chill moved slowly down from the ridge. The air was quiet in a way that felt expectant, as if something unseen held its breath. Inside her small office, Emma Clark sat at her desk with the papers Jake had brought spread carefully in front of her. Jake and Max waited in the corner of the room. Max lay on the floor, but his eyes stayed open and alert, following every motion. Emma leaned forward, her brow slightly drawn as she studied the notebook entries and the letters. She had tied her dark hair back as she usually did when working intensely, and a faint line appeared between her eyebrows, a sign that she was processing something troubling. Emma was in her early 30s, and her appearance carried both softness and structure. Her jawline was clean, her cheekbones defined, and her deep brown eyes held a steadiness that made people believe she truly listened. It was a quality shaped by years of watching her father suffer through injury and paperwork and denial before she became a lawyer. She had grown into someone who could recognize injustice at a glance and refuse to step away from it. After nearly an hour of reading, she exhaled slowly. Her voice was calm but firm when she finally spoke. "These documents have been altered," she said. "Someone rewrote the records. Important sections are missing, and the wording is too clean to be the truth. It was shaped to blame one man." Jake felt his chest tighten further. The weight of the Miller name had been pressing on him for days, and Emma's words only deepened the pressure. Max lifted his head, sensing the shift in Jake's breathing. Emma continued speaking, but her tone softened. "The handwriting in these letters is genuine. The notebook, too. Whoever this engineer was, he tried to warn someone. He tried to prevent a disaster." Jake remained quiet. He stared at the papers and felt a mixture of anger and sorrow twist together. He imagined the engineer writing those final lines and carrying the fear of not being believed. He knew that feeling. He had felt it in the desert more than once, when orders did not make sense and yet had to be followed. Emma gently closed the notebook and looked at Jake directly. "Someone rewrote this history," she said, "and someone wanted the truth buried." Before Jake could respond, Max suddenly stood up, his ears sharp and his body tense. The dog strode toward the door, with a low rumble in his throat. Emma and Jake exchanged a glance. Emma rose and stepped to the window, lifting the curtain slightly. A black SUV rolled slowly past the front of her office. Its windows were tinted so dark she could not see inside. It moved quietly and with a strange level of deliberation, as if it wished to be noticed, but not understood. Jake felt a cold sensation move through him. Emma let the curtain fall. "That vehicle has been circling the block for the last 15 minutes, she said. Jake knew, without needing to say it aloud, that this was not a coincidence. He thanked Emma and left the office with Max at his heels. The walk back toward his cabin was tense. Every sound seemed louder. Every shifting shadow felt too watchful. Jake felt the old instincts from his deployment rise quietly inside him. It was a controlled awareness, a way of reading danger before it spoke. Near the bend in the road, leading toward his cabin, a man stepped out from behind a parked truck. He was dressed in a charcoal suit with a neatly pressed collar and a heavy coat that gave him a stiff, formal look. He was in his mid-40s, with sharp cheekbones and deep-set eyes that revealed little emotion. His hair was cut short in a precise business style, and his posture was straight with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He offered Jake a polished smile, but the expression did not reach his eyes. The man spoke in a calm, measured voice. "You must be Jake Miller." Jake did not answer immediately. Max moved in front of him, slightly protective, with his stance angled and alert. The man kept the same thin smile. I work with North Star Energy. I hear you have been asking questions. Jake stood still. North Star Energy was the name attached to the rail line and the cargo from the notebook. The man gave a faint nod, as if confirming a private thought. Some history is best left where it is, he said. Buried. People get hurt when old stories are dug up. He tilted his head just slightly, a friendly suggestion. Do not dig too deep. Jake felt an old familiar heat rise in him. It was the feeling that came when injustice pressed into him and demanded silent acceptance. He said nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on the man. The man glanced at Max, a dismissive look that only sharpened the unease in the air. Then he stepped back toward his SUV and climbed in. The vehicle rolled away quietly, its black frame swallowed by the dimming light. Jake stood still, long after it disappeared. The warning echoed in his mind, but he felt no fear. What he felt instead was resolve, tightening inside him, like a cord drawn taut. That night, the wind grew stronger, sweeping around the cabin with restless gusts. Jake fed the stove a few logs and let the small room fill with warmth. Max lay near the door, but his body was tense and his ears flicked at every sound outside. Jake tried to settle, but unease pulled at him. He moved to the window and looked out toward the tree line. The darkness lay thick between the trunks. Only the faint outline of brush moved with the wind. He sat down at the table and stared again at the notebook and the letters. The truth felt closer now, but danger did as well. He thought of the engineer and how a man had been silenced by the weight of power. The same weight now pushed toward him. A sudden thud against the cabin wall snapped through the quiet. Max bolted upright and barked sharply. Jake moved fast, the instinctive speed of a soldier returning for a moment. When he opened the door, Max rushed past him, toward the side of the cabin. Jake followed with his heart pounding. In the weak moonlight, he saw small rocks scattered near the wall. He heard branches crack deeper in the brush as someone fled into the woods. Max gave a pained yelp, and Jake spun toward him. The dog was limping slightly, his back leg pulled close to his body. Jake knelt and ran his hands gently along the leg until Max flinched at a tender spot near the ankle. A stone lay nearby, with a smear of fresh dirt on its edge. Someone had thrown it with intent, not as a random act, but a warning. Jake felt a deep, slow anger rise in him. It was not loud. It was not fast. It was the steady, controlled fire that came when someone threatened what little he had left in this world. He lifted Max carefully and carried him inside the cabin. Sitting beside the dog, Jake cleaned the small wound and wrapped it in a strip of cloth. Max pressed close to him, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the shock of the sudden attack. Jake rested one hand on the dog's head. "We are being watched," he said quietly, more to himself than to Max. The truth was no longer a distant story. It was now something that touched his home, his dog, his life directly. As he sat on the floor, near the warm stove, with Max leaning against him, Jake felt a cold clarity settle inside his mind. Someone did not want the past uncovered. Someone was willing to frighten him into silence. But Jake had lived through war. He had carried wounded brothers through sandstorms. He had faced nights where the sky shook with fire. He would not be frightened away by rocks thrown in the dark. The chapter ended with Jake holding Max steady, feeling both fear for the dog and a growing determination. Whatever lay beneath the mountain, whatever had been hidden and twisted into lies, he would not turn away. The hunt had begun, but he would face it. The morning arrived with a pale gray sky, stretching low across the ridge as a cold mist drifted between the trees. The air carried the damp scent of moss and stone, and each breath felt cool enough to burn slightly in the lungs. A quiet stillness hung over the forest, like a veil, as Jake stepped outside, with Max at his heel. Emma joined them shortly after, carrying her small leather bag and a folded copy of the map they had studied most of the night. Her face looked more serious than usual. The lack of sleep made faint shadows appear beneath her eyes, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Emma reviewed the map again as they walked through the narrow trail. She traced each line with her finger. The map had been drawn decades ago, lettered by hand and faded by time. Jake followed beside her, his steps steady but silent as the weight of the truth pressed against him like a stone in his chest. He kept glancing toward Max, who seemed more alert than usual. The dog sniffed the air, then the ground, then the trees ahead. His movements were focused and careful. Emma moved gracefully, though the terrain was uneven. Her coat brushed against the branches, and her hair tied back in a loose knot shifted with each step. She was young for a lawyer, but her demeanor carried the confidence of someone who had learned the cost of standing alone. She had grown up watching her father battle through a system that often ignored the powerless, and that experience had carved a deep sense of duty into her character. Jake, on the other hand, felt his mind split between the present and the ghosts of the past. Every stone cracking under his boots reminded him of patrol routes in distant deserts where danger waited without warning. But this forest, this mountain, this secret felt heavier than anything he had carried in war. It was not only the thought of the train or the erased history. It was the thought of what had been done to his family name, and what might have happened to the man behind that notebook, the man everyone once blamed. They followed the slope until the trees grew denser and the ground shifted upward. Emma checked the map again. According to the notebook, the entrance to the hidden tunnel lay somewhere behind the eastern ridge, where old granite walls pressed close together. Jake scanned the terrain and nodded toward a cluster of boulders rising near the tree line. When they reached the rocks, Max moved ahead quickly. The dog sniffed every crack and patch of earth. His ears rose sharply, and he barked once short and loud. Jake felt something tighten in his chest. He stepped forward and crouched beside the dog. Max placed his paws against a tall slab of stone and barked again, louder this time, with urgency. Emma approached. He found something, she said. Jake brushed aside loose dirt and tangled roots. Beneath them lay an unnatural shape. A flat surface, cold and smooth under the dirt. Jake dug faster, and Emma knelt beside him, using her sleeve to sweep dust away from the edges. A rectangular outline began to appear beneath the soil. "It is concrete," Jake said, his voice low with disbelief. "Poured by hand, no question." Emma placed her palm on the exposed section. It felt old, but still solid. Whoever built this wanted it sealed. Jake continued removing dirt from the lower edge until a faint line appeared, a seam just wide enough to hint at something behind it. Then Max let out a deep bark and scratched at the ground again, his tail stiff, his body tense. Jake felt the rush of certainty move through him. This was the place. The map had been right. The engineer's last message had guided them straight to it. They worked for hours, pulling away rocks, prying loose slabs, and clearing a path around the sealed entrance. Sweat dripped down Jake's temples despite the cold air. Emma's hands grew raw from dragging stone, but she refused to stop. Max stayed close, watching each movement, his ears always alert to the forest behind them. Near late afternoon, A thin crack opened across the center of the concrete. Jake wedged his crowbar into the opening and leaned his full weight against it. The concrete groaned, then shifted. A gust of frigid air swept through the crack, brushing against their skin with the sharp smell of rust and old machinery. Jake stepped back, slightly stunned by the sudden breath from the darkness. Emma shined her flashlight into the gap. The beam slipped past dust and drifting particles until it touched something curved and metallic in the shadows. She froze. Jake leaned forward, his heart beating hard. The dust danced in the cold air, and the outline became clear. A steam locomotive, he whispered. It was impossible, and yet it was there. The massive headlight sat dark and hollow, the front plate streaked with rust, frozen in time behind decades of earth. The old metal looked like a sleeping giant curled within the mountain, waiting for someone to wake it. Max trembled lightly, his body caught between fear and duty. He stepped toward the opening, sniffing the cold air, then walked inside with slow, cautious steps. His tail lowered, but did not tuck under. He moved carefully the way he used to on dangerous ground during training and service. Jake felt a swell of pride and worry rise together. Jake looked at Emma. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a fierce light. She nodded once. "It really is here," she said softly. "Everything in the letters, everything your grandfather tried to warn them about." Jake felt a deep ache inside his chest. All the shame, all the anger, all the doubt that had followed him since learning the story, now twisted into something else. A kind of truth rising out of the earth. The cold wind continued to drift from the tunnel, carrying the scent of steel and forgotten years. Jake placed his hand on the edge of the opening. This was only the beginning. But the train had been found, and Max stood guard at its entrance. The air inside the mountainside was cold and dense. A thin sheet of mist clung to the ground, where the first light from their flashlights cut through the shadows. The tunnel breathed a faint metallic chill that drifted over Jake, Emma, and Max as they stepped deeper inside. The silence felt heavy, as if the mountain itself waited for them to uncover what had been buried for decades. Jake walked ahead with slow, deliberate steps. His pulse beat with a mixture of dread and awe. He had braced himself for ruins or fragments or anything that spoke of collapse. But what stood before them now felt unreal. The locomotive appeared slowly in the beam of light. Its curved steel face rose like a monument from the past. Rust streaked along the metal, but the shape remained whole. The engine rested on the tracks exactly as it had the day it vanished. Jake drew a steady breath. He felt an ache in his chest, as though he were standing at the grave of a man he had never met but had carried in his blood. Emma stood beside him, her voice quiet and controlled. "It is untouched," she said. Her eyes traced every line of the machine. Her breath trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. Emma had always been composed in the office courtroom or field, yet here in the heart of the mountain, her certainty shifted into wonder. Max sniffed the tracks, then the wheels, then the air around the engine. His body moved in focused circles, his tail low but not tucked. He understood instinctively that the darkness here carried weight and danger. His paws clicked against the metal plate at the base of the locomotive, and he let out one low, cautious bark. Jake climbed up the side ladder leading to the cab. Each step echoed softly into the hollow tunnel. When he reached the top, he pushed open the narrow metal door. It resisted, then gave way with a long groan. Inside the cabin, dust lay thick over every surface. The old control levers rested in place, frozen in mid-motion. The steel floor felt cold enough to bite through the soles of his boots. On the small bench sat a metal lunchbox, dented but sealed. Beside it lay a pocket watch, still attached to a tarnished chain. Jake picked it up and brushed away the dust with his thumb. The glass face was cracked, but the hands had stopped at a specific moment, fixed forever in time. He set it carefully beside the lunchbox. His flashlight moved further across the console until it fell upon a worn notebook lying half hidden under the throttle handle. Jake picked it up slowly. The leather cover had dried and curled, but the pages inside were still intact. The handwriting on the first page was strong, though hurried. It was the last journal of the engineer. Jake felt a tightness form in his throat as he read the first few lines in silence. The engineer had written about the fear in the crew, about the cargo they were forced to carry, about the refusal that had been ignored, about the warning that had gone unheard. Every sentence weighed heavier than the last. Jake closed the book gently. This was the truth no one had listened to. Emma climbed into the cab. Her steady eyes scanned the items. She placed her hand over the notebook with great care. This is enough to change everything, she said. Her voice was soft, but filled with conviction. The words carried a quiet fire. This could clear your family name, Jake, and expose everything they hid. They moved toward the cargo cars behind the engine. Max led them nose to the ground. Inside the first car, the beam of their lights met rows of sealed crates still strapped to the floor. Jake pried one open with a metal rod. Inside were large cylindrical containers wrapped in military cloth. The stenciled markings had faded, but the words remained readable. Experimental chemical compound, extreme hazard, authorized transport only. Emma leaned close to the exposed documents piled beside the crates. Some were brittle, some stained, but all of them bore the same stamp: property of North Star Energy. Jake felt his shoulders stiffen. They knew it was unstable, he said quietly. They knew it could kill them. Emma nodded. And they forced the crew to move it anyway, she whispered. This is the proof, and it is worse than anything we expected. For a moment, the three stood still. Max pressed close to Jake, sensing the storm of emotion rising inside him. Pride and anger and sorrow tangled deep in his chest. Everything he had carried for so long began to shift. His family had not run. They had tried to save the valley. The truth had not died. It had waited for him. When they finally stepped back toward the mouth of the tunnel, the faint sound of an engine throbbed through the trees outside. Jake froze. Emma turned sharply, her breath catching. Max growled, low ears pinned forward. The light from the tunnel opening flickered as shadows moved past. The black SUV. Jake grabbed Emma's arm. We need to move now. They rushed toward the side trail, leading into the thicker trees. Max ran ahead, limping slightly from the earlier injury, but still determined. Branches scraped against Jake's coat as they pushed deeper into the dark. Behind them, gravel crunched sharply under heavy tires. A door slammed. Voices rose. Flashlights cut through the forest edges. Emma stumbled once, but Jake held her steady. Max barked sharply, as if guiding them. They reached the narrow bend in the trail and scrambled behind the rocks. Heavy footsteps passed close enough to shake the ground. Jake held Max close, his hand gripping the dog's collar to keep him from lunging. The forest seemed to hold its breath. After several tense moments, the sounds faded. The beams of light drifted away. The SUV engine roared, then began moving back toward the main ridge. Emma exhaled slowly, her chest trembling. Jake stroked Max's neck, whispering steadying words. The dog pressed close, leaning into him. Together, they waited until the forest fell silent again. Jake looked at Emma. Their eyes met with the same realization. It was too late to turn back. The truth had crossed a line that North Star Energy would never allow. But the truth was theirs now, and they would not let it die in the mountain. The morning sky was pale and quiet, with thin clouds drifting slowly over the town. A cool breeze moved through the streets, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil. The air felt heavy but expectant, as if the world waited for something long buried to rise again. Emma sat at her desk in the small law office, her eyes fixed on the screen of her laptop, while Jake and Max stood nearby. Emma looked tired. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, and the faint lines of exhaustion under her eyes showed how long she had been awake. Still, her posture remained steady, calm, and focused. She had the resolve of someone who understood the weight of truth and the cost of carrying it into the light. She clicked through the files one by one, the video of the tunnel, the photographs of the locomotive, the pages of the final journal, and the documents from the cargo car. Jake stood near the window, his shoulders squared and his jaw tight. His mind felt like a storm held inside a cage. For so many years he had carried shame that did not belong to him. Now he held proof that his family had been wronged. But with that proof came danger. He watched Emma with a mixture of gratitude and worry. She was risking much by helping him. Max lay at his feet, his ears shifting at every sound outside. The dog's body was tense but steady. Though still recovering, he refused to rest. He sensed the pressure surrounding Jake and stayed close as if guarding him from invisible threats. Emma took a slow breath and pressed the button to send the entire set of evidence to the State Investigative Division. Her fingers lingered on the keyboard, as if bracing for what would come next. "It is done," she said in a quiet, firm voice. "They will have everything. The train, the chemicals, the journal. They can no longer deny the truth." Jake nodded, but said nothing. Inside him, emotions moved like deep currents, relief mixed with fear, vindication blended with dread. He had learned during war that truth could be both shield and blade. Once drawn, it could not be put away. News spread faster than he expected. Local authorities reacted with confusion. The state investigators responded with urgency. But North Star Energy struck back immediately. Their official statement called the evidence fabricated. They claimed the video was staged. They implied Jake was unstable, a veteran with lingering trauma who had fallen for a conspiracy. The words stung with familiar cruelty. Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had heard similar whispers when he first returned from deployment. He had learned long ago that some people chose to fear what they did not understand. Emma's expression hardened. "They are trying to break your spirit," she said. "This is what corporations do when the truth threatens them. They attack the messenger. But we have the documents. We have the train. And soon, everyone else will see it too." That afternoon, journalists arrived. First from nearby towns, then from larger cities. Their questions came sharp and rapid, but their faces held unmistakable shock when Emma showed them the photos. Many had grown up hearing whispers of the lost relief train, a legend of the mountains. A rumor passed from one generation to another. To see it real, to see its metal frame buried beneath the ridge, left them speechless. Jake stood before them, feeling strangely hollow. He never wanted attention. He never wanted headlines. All he had ever wanted was the truth. Yet now he stood under the weight of dozens of eyes. Max pressed against his leg, as if sensing the tremble in Jake's breath. This small touch grounded him and helped him find his voice. He spoke simply. The engineer was not a failure. He tried to save this valley. They silenced him, and they silenced my family. Emma watched him with quiet pride. Soon, the story reached the wider veteran community. Men who had served in distant wars came forward with words of support. They recognized the look in Jake's eyes, a mix of scars and stubborn honor. Some sent messages to the local press condemning North Star Energy for exploiting a crew that did not have the power to refuse. Others spoke publicly, saying they believed Jake because they had lived through similar betrayals. The town reacted with disbelief at first. Many older residents had grown up hearing only the version passed down by North Star. They had been taught that the engineer was a coward or worse. But when the photos of the train emerged, when the journal pages were printed in the newspapers, when the crates of chemicals were shown in the reports, the disbelief turned into shock. People gathered outside the law office, unable to grasp how such a secret had remained buried under their feet for half a century. One elderly resident stepped forward, her voice trembling. "My father used to say that the engineer was a good man," she whispered. "They ruined his name. They ruined his family." She looked at Jake, tears forming. "I am sorry for what they did to yours." Jake did not know how to respond. A lifetime of silent shame pressed against him all at once. But somewhere in that pressure, a lightness formed, like a crack opening in a long buried wall. The truth had begun to breathe again. By the end of the week, the state announced a full investigation into North Star Energy. Officials confirmed that the company had knowingly transported hazardous experimental chemicals. They confirmed that records had been altered. They confirmed that the train crew had not been at fault. North Star tried to counter, but the evidence was overwhelming. Their denials grew weaker with every hour. Jake stood beside Emma as the final announcement played on the small television inside her office. Max rested at their feet, his head on his paws. Emma folded her arms and breathed deeply. "Justice has begun," she said. Not finished, but begun. Jake felt something inside him settle for the first time in years. The truth was no longer buried in the mountain. It was rising, and the world had finally begun to listen. The day began with a soft golden sun rising over Iron Valley. A gentle wind swept across the hills, carrying the scent of warm grass and distant pine. The sky was clear and wide, as if the world itself were opening its arms after a long winter of darkness. Jake stood outside his cabin, with Max at his side, and felt the quiet warmth settle into his chest. For the first time in many years, his spirit felt unburdened. The truth had come out. The world had seen what lay beneath the mountain. And now, they waited for the final judgment that would decide the future of everything connected to the train, the valley, and his family name. Emma drove up the dirt road early that morning. Dust lifted behind her car as she stepped out, holding a stack of official papers. Her expression carried something softer than victory, something like peace. Her dark hair was tied back neatly, and sunlight touched her features with a warm glow. Max trotted toward her tail, wagging lightly, though still cautious as always. Emma knelt to greet him with a small smile before standing to face Jake. "It is official," she said. "The state has released the final statement." Jake felt his body tighten instinctively. Years of quiet pain, years of living under a shadow, pressed together into a single moment. Emma handed him the documents, and he unfolded the top page with steady hands. The words were clear and strong. The state of Montana formally exonerates engineer William Miller of the 1950 Iron Valley incident. The accident was the result of corporate coercion, unsafe cargo, and the unlawful actions of North Star Energy. The blame placed on the engineer and his family was unjust. Jake lowered the page slowly. A deep breath slipped from him, one he did not realize he had been holding for years. It was not relief that moved through him, but something deeper. A long, buried grief beginning to finally heal. His family name no longer carried the weight of a lie. Emma watched him quietly, letting the moment settle. She understood the significance more than most. Her own history had taught her what it meant for a family to fight against power. The next pages declared penalties against North Star Energy. The corporation was ordered to pay restitution to the Valley, restore damaged land, and withdraw from Iron Valley entirely. Their leadership faced investigation and public scrutiny. The truth had not only risen, it had reshaped the land around it. Jake looked up at the mountains. The ridge no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like a threshold. Max leaned against his leg, sensing the shift in his breathing. Jake placed a hand gently on the dog's back. "You did this," he murmured quietly. "You found the box. You found the tunnel." Max gazed up at him with steady dark eyes, as if understanding every word. A few days later, the work began. Crews and heavy equipment arrived to remove the old stone and earth sealing the tunnel. Reporters gathered. Townspeople came in small groups. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, many of them placing hands on Jake's back with quiet respect. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion, but lifted by hope. Jake and Emma stood near the entrance as the final section of concrete was pulled away. The front of the locomotive emerged into full daylight for the first time in more than 70 years. Sunlight struck the rusted steel, and the engine glowed faintly, as if waking from a deep, long sleep. Gasps rose from the crowd. Some people wiped tears from their faces. Legends had turned into reality. History had risen from the ground. The train was slowly pulled from the tunnel by a restoration crew using reinforced cables. Max watched with alert fascination, ears raised and tail still. The locomotive rolled forward onto stable ground and settled with a soft metallic groan. A plaque was placed in front of it, dedicated to the railroad workers of Iron Valley and to those whose voices were silenced but not lost. Emma stood beside Jake. Her voice was low but filled with meaning. "This is justice, Jake. Not only for the engineer, for every person who was told to stay silent." Jake looked at the train. The weight inside him had finally lifted. His grandfather had been innocent. His family had carried an undeserved burden for decades. Now the world knew the truth. The valley finally knew the truth. Children walked near the base of the engine, pointing with awe. Older residents approached quietly, laying flowers and touching the metal with reverence. The lost train had returned, not as a weapon, not as a secret, but as a memorial. Jake felt Max press against his leg again. The dog's steady presence brought him back into the moment. He lifted his hand and rested it on Max's head. "We made it, boy," he whispered. Max's tail thumped once against the ground. Emma smiled gently. "And you made history," she said. But Jake shook his head. "No. We brought back someone's honor. That is more important." The sun rose higher, casting warm light over the valley. The train, the people, the hills, and the sky all seemed to breathe together. Jake closed his eyes and felt peace settle over him. A real peace. The kind born not from forgetfulness, but from truth. The tunnel was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of closure. And the valley was no longer haunted. It was finally free. In the end, the story of Jake Miller, Emma, and Max became more than the uncovering of an old train. It became a reminder that truth may sleep in the dark for years, but it never dies. It waits for the right hearts to rise with courage. Their journey showed that ordinary people can carry extraordinary strength, and that even the deepest wounds can heal when justice finally breathes again. The town learned to stand together, and the valley found hope where fear once lived. And maybe it was not only human hands guiding them. Perhaps it was a quiet miracle, a gentle touch from God, who brings truth to light in His time. In our daily lives, we all walk through tunnels of doubt and struggle, yet there is always a way out into a brighter place. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment, join our community, and subscribe for more stories of hope. And may God bless you and your family with peace, strength, and light in every step you take.